Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final Recess Argumenta Distinguished Lecture for 2023. And thank you for being with us today in person or online. This event is organized by Recess, Rethinking the Serviceability of Economics to Society, and funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting a distinguished lecture by Professor Uskali Mäki, who will lead us on a journey through the fascinating world of Homo Economicus. Professor Mäki's lecture promises to be inspiring and thought-provoking, giving us a unique chance to explore the ties between our assumptions, the way we build institutions, and the dreams we have for our society. Uskali Mäki needs no introduction, but I will try to introduce him anyway. Uskali Mäki is a professor emeritus of Practical Philosophy at the University of Helsinki, directing TINT, Center for Philosophy of Social Science. Previously, he was Professor of Philosophy at the Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands, directing EIPE, Erasmus Institute for Philosophy and Economics. Professor Mäki served as an academic professor at the University of Helsinki from 2006 to 2011, and again from 2013 to 2017. During his tenure, he established TINT as a prominent research center in the philosophy of the social sciences in 2006. Under his leadership, TINT secured Center of Excellence funding from the Academy of Finland between 2012 and 2017. He is a former editor of the Journal of Economic Methodology and the former chair of the International Network for Economic Method. He has held visiting positions at universities in Europe, North America, China, and Africa, and he currently sits in the editorial boards of 10 journals. His current research is mainly on the philosophy of economics and on models, scientific realism, interdisciplinarity, and social aspects of science. Professor Mäki is a prolific author, credited with numerous influential articles in the philosophy of science and notably the philosophy of economics. His scholarly impact extends further through his role as an editor of many key collected volumes in the philosophy of economics, shaping the discourse in this field. Professor Mäki continues to actively contribute to academic discourse as the PI of the project Economics as Serviceable Social Knowledge, funded by the Academy of Finland. This project underscores his commitment to advancing our understanding of the social consequences of economics, particularly in the challenging context of multiple evolving crises. Uskali, many thanks for agreeing to give this talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma, for those excessively kind words. And also perhaps for having over-advertised this, this event. Actually, the actual number of people here on spot would match the contents of what's to come. But actually thinking of why exactly there are so few people here today, physically present, one might, the immediate explanation, of course, is strike by the unions. It's a political strike against the government. And now thinking of our theme today, Homo Economicus, one might attribute some of the properties, characteristics of Homo Economicus to the unions and their members. They are just greedy. They just selfishly want to have more and more, and they don't care about the rest of society and things like that. Okay. But if you think a bit more carefully, this is exactly what they don't like. They are responding, they are reacting to the government policies, and those policies are based on the idea that everybody in society is a Homo Economicus. People only respond to monetary incentives. There's nothing else. And this would lead to a society that the unions would not like. There's more to come on these themes, but I just wanted to make an opening remark about when making this observation about the audience here in this pretty large space. I'm sure you like the fancy title. It's again more fancy than the talk, but don't be disappointed. Anyway, the topic is extremely important. It's broad-ranging, but also very complex. If we start with this question, on what grounds to assume, and then on the other hand, relax this assumption that people are like Homo economicus in economics and other social sciences, perhaps, or maybe elsewhere in biology, for that matter. Then questions arise as to what's good science, what's good social science like, how do they proceed in terms of making these sorts of idealizations. Issues of multidisciplinarity arise. I mean, is this kind of model of man, as they say, that could be used in a number of different disciplines. Also, various disciplines may illuminate the ways in which Homo economicus functions, this very assumption functions in economics and elsewhere in society, what kind of consequences using this assumption has for people, our mentality, society at large, and so forth. So questions arise as to who are we, what do we want to be, what's good society like, where is the civilization going? Big questions, I mean, really, really big. What are good policies like, etc.? Is the kind of incentive-based policy that the current government is exercising the right way to go, or should it be something different? So it's a very, very broad theme, and that's why I'm going to use a very broad brush, zooming out, but also it's a very confused theme. There's a huge literature. It's very difficult to read even one half of it in a year or so. Because of all these confusions and ambiguities and whatever you have there, you need a sharp pen at times, so zooming in, of course, but this is exactly what the philosopher's job is like, you know, zooming out and zooming in and so forth. While there is less such a thing going on in the factual sciences. There is this idea that it's time to say goodbye to Homo economicus. It's dead, it's extinct. It's a character belonging to the past only. It has no future. We have learned so much about human behavior that there is no reason to stick to this character anymore. And this is indeed because of compelling evidence has accumulated against it. And this accumulation of evidence has been enabled by the new alliance between economics and psychology and some other fields. There's experimental scientific evidence against us being Homo economici. But still, it seems to be providing useful services for these fields, so it's too early to reject it entirely. So we are in an interesting situation where there are these declaration of its death on the one hand, and it still seems to be surviving for some useful purposes. Also, it would seem to be an absurd notion for the common sense. We don't sort of portray ourselves in those terms. We don't think of ourselves as extremely egoistic, extremely calculative, extremely asocial, extremely immoral, and those kinds of characteristics that are typically part of the Homo economicus model. But yet, we recognize this model. We recognize this set of characteristics, and actually, it seems that this model serves as a part of our interpretive schemes in daily social life, especially when we encounter others in the market. I recently published a paper on Homo economicus under multiple pressures, and there are divided these pressures into 4 pressures: from economics, from the common sense, from neighboring disciplines, from social reality. And the idea was that some of these pressures are in support of Homo economicus, some others are against it. In support would come from economics, because economics needs to have downward sloping demand curves and upward sloping supply curves in order to have a market equilibrium. and Homo economicus serves that purpose wonderfully under certain subject to certain disciplinary conventions, tractability conventions, conventions concerning unification and those kinds of things. From the common sense, as I just a moment ago said, we don't quite recognize ourselves as being like that fellow, and therefore there seems to be a clash there. From neighboring disciplines, indeed, psychology seems to be teaching us that we are not like that. Okay, so it speaks against it, but as I will show later, it's kind of yes and no. From social reality, there are powerful forces in social reality that actually keep pushing us towards becoming ever closer approximations to Homo economicus. Now I'm thinking of this paper as a starting point, and then I here provide some elaborations, amendments, and some new perspectives, maybe some slight revisions too. Plan to do much more, but the time didn't allow for that. Also, just a few weeks ago, I was at Stanford for this David Krebs symposium. The theme was Homo economicus evolving. A couple of economists and a psychologist and a philosopher discussing the roles and nature and the future evolution of Homo economicus. David Krebs has a fresh book on these issues, arguing about taste. I mean, it's part of one of the versions of Homo economicus that de gustibus non est disputandum. Taste preferences are to be taken as given, and he's arguing against that by arguing about tastes. So I learned a bit of some of these things on that occasion too. So I will be sharing those here. Now here is the one kind of simplified account that you actually find in the literature, especially in blog posts and somewhere else as well, even in serious academic publications. Homo economicus is dead, and is dead due to accumulated negative empirical evidence. So let's move on to other and better models, and that's exactly, I mean, what the natural scientists would do if they were to be faced with such a vast amount of negative evidence. And then the question is, why doesn't this happen? Why hasn't it already happened? Why doesn't it happen sooner? There is a very, very nice quotation from a behavioral economist blaming his colleagues for not moving sooner to other options, other views of human behavior. His preferred explanation for the reluctance to accept the evidence is that many economists need better training in methodology and the philosophy of science. So they should go to philosophy of science class and learn how natural scientists actually, what good science is like when there's negative evidence. Give up your theory and replace it with a better theory. So in fact, contemporary philosophy of science has a much more complicated story to tell about what good science looks like and how scientific change comes about. I'll skip that. So this is basically the kind of the primitive idea that seems to drive some of these pronouncements. You know, we have these portraits, and some of them don't quite look like the original. And then those that do not look like the original need to be discarded. We have visual evidence that they don't look like that, etc. So kill them. They deserve to be to die, etc. So here maybe only the right hand side would be sufficiently similar to the original and might survive, but others don't. That kind of primitive thinking. So a better idea would be to suggest that it's not empirical evidence alone, but empirical evidence plus a number of other things that would have to be taken into account when thinking of how an idea evolves, what happens to it, especially when having troubles with empirical evidence. There's a theoretical and technical environment around that idea. There are methodological conventions, those of tractability, parsimony, unification, microfoundations, etc. Those that you find in standard economics, for example. There are all sorts of functions, purposes, uses, questions, both intra and extra scientific, that also play a role. Considerations of scope and domain of applicability. These I will have much more to say about these in a moment. And then the academic institutions and other social aspects of inquiry, such as network externalities that govern much of what is being taken on board for further elaboration and critical scrutiny and so forth. And it's obvious that when you think of this situation regarding behavioral economics being critical of the standard Homo Economicus construct, and you compare, say, Herbert Simon, he tried. I mean, it's a kind of first generation behavioral economics, and then Kahneman Tversky, the later generation. Kahneman Tversky have been much more successful than Simon was, and it's explainable just in these terms. It's of course, hard rhetorical work and those kinds of things, but satisfying some of the tractability constraints, some of the ideas of unification, etc., and then gradually developing those social or academic network externalities within the economics community helped Kahneman and Tversky get through and on the agenda of much of mainstream economics. So what about the role of psychology that has been played a role here? There's often this hopeful talk that, finally economics is opening up and taking ideas from psychology, and there are collaborations and things like that. Now we have a much richer idea of what human activity is like, etc., with all those cognitive failures and what have you. Now, this shows clearly in many of these statements by behavioral economists. Now, finally, we have more realistic psychological foundations for economics, or more psychologically plausible foundations, or and Agner and Löwenstein say with psychologically plausible, we mean consistent with the best available psychology. Now, think of psychology itself. I mean, there's this appeal as if psychology has some higher authority. Of course, there is something strange going on here that economics is paying attention to a neighboring discipline, because it doesn't happen much of the time. So there has been a change in this respect, but the authority of psychology as a source of serious insight, you might raise some interesting observations about it, such as these. Psychology itself is theoretically, etc., very fragmented discipline. It lacks the uniformity that economics has. So you can pick and choose whatever you wish, etc. So without actually having the authority of the discipline of psychology playing any role whatsoever. And of course, psychology is the discipline that has suffered most by these scandals of replication issues. And the second observation, how does an outsider, like an economist, determine what is the best available and reliable enough in psychology to provide these foundations for one's own theoretical endeavors? But also very interestingly is much of psychology is focused on identifying and correcting individual dysfunction. This is what they do. Is that exactly what economics needs? Psychologists diagnose mental problems in individuals, and then provide of corrections and remedies and cures and so forth. Is this kind of, actually we do find this mentality, this ethos also in behavioral economics. I will have more to say about that. And then of course there's a disciplinary filter at the receiving end within economics. Economics has its own disciplinary conventions and dictates and so forth, and those then constitute the filter that helps make the selections. Those that go through the filter will be taken on board, and those that don't aren't. Okay, here is the menu of what I plan to talk. What are we talking about? What is this fellow, Homo economicus? Is there indeed a move from Homo economicus to Homo sapiens? What explains what? Applicability conditions, roles of idealizations in explanation, forces that push us towards Homo economicus, and the fate of Homo sapiens after all this. There's a lot here. I'm fully aware of that. So anyway, here we go. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the thing in terms of properties that are described in terms of assumptions, and then we have models of Homo economicus, and here is a list of characteristics that have a lot of commonsensical nuance. You don't find these lists in economics textbooks, or even they're probably not discussed in economics classes, etc. But when you simply look at the various versions of it in the history of the notion, you can pick and choose and put them together in a list. And here we go. Homo economicus is determined, informed, he's a chooser, self-seeking, greedy, calculative, emotionless, amoral, asocial, those kinds of things. Not a very nice guy, I would say. Anyway, but then those different versions of Homo economicus that we find in different economic theories and theoreticians in the course of the history of the discipline, they are kind of permutations of these characteristics, each of which is kind of idealized differently with different in different degrees, etc. But much of the time, you don't. Whenever you have a model of Homo economicus written down, you don't see all the assumptions that are required. I mean, much of it is implicit only, and those implicit parts of those assumptions might only come up when the model gets in trouble or it's challenged or some such situation. So it's very difficult to find articulate and complete expression of Homo economicus in any economics textbooks, for example, etc. It's actually not a technical term in economics at all. I mean, they talk about rationality at times, etc., and even that is often defined differently in different textbooks and so forth. But Homo economicus is much more infrequently used by economists themselves. But of course, this is an important observation to make. Not only is Homo economicus self-centered, he is a murdering psychopath. I mean, if you look at that list of characteristics, of course, I mean, these are almost like, expressions of this pathological case of sociopaths or psychopaths. Anyway. So there are many historical incarnations of this fellow. The very expression Homo Economicus was coined in 1878 insofar as we know today. There might be earlier ones, but they are to be discovered by historians. Economic man as an expression appeared just a few years earlier. And both these in critical context, when a theory was criticized for its kind of less than perfectly pleasant image of human nature or some such thing. And then we have, I mean, we can look backwards to all the way to Adam Smith and before that. And then we have Samuelson, Savage, and others closer to today. And then we have varieties of behavioral economics that add these psychological ingredients in the picture. Now, there is a variation here across history along various dimensions, you know, and it seems to me, I mean, zooming out now really powerfully, that initially with Adam Smith and even Millen and others at that time, the picture, the image of human behavior was pretty thick, all sorts of ingredients included. Then it got thinner and thinner and thinner. Samuelson, Savage, I mean, very, very thin. And then it may be becoming thicker again. Ingredients are being added to the image from psychology and everyday observation and what have you. This is another dimension, internal or mental, external behavior, and maybe it's becoming, I mean, external and behavioral, Samuelson's revealed preference and so forth. Whereas initially, I mean, economists speculated about what happens in the minds of economic agents, and then that was put aside. And now it may be becoming internal again, at least to some extent. And also thinking of interdisciplinary relations. Initially, of course, I mean, their social science disciplines did not exist in the way that they exist today. So economics was political economy, whatever you called it, had its doors open for interdisciplinary inputs for wherever. And then the clause were closed. You know, economics declared academic, intellectual, disciplinary autonomy. We are self-sufficient. We don't care about what happens elsewhere. For instance, regarding human behavior, doesn't touch us at all. And now they are sort of opening the doors again, at least a jar, at least a little bit, not fully. Oh, you put it in terms of realisticness. Initially, the image was more realistic, then became increasingly unrealistic, and now maybe more realistic again, at least in some ways, some senses of this term. Thinking of the kind of field of inquiry, decision theory is something, price theory is something else, theory of social coordination yet something else. It's depends on the field of inquiry what kind of image of human behavior you adopt. Pure theory typically allows for much more variety of behaviors, whereas applied theory, when you do applied research, you need to specify, for instance, the objective functions. It's not okay to say that people pursue whatever they want. You need to say they want money or some such thing. Okay, here is, of course, the expected utility version, which is the Savage style thing. You have only well-ordered preferences, etc., and then the agent seeks to maximize the expected value of the utility. This is very, very flexible. It allows for multiple specifications, etc. But this is at the thin side. But this has been much of the time, especially when specified in terms of what the arguments are in the utility function, has been very much a target of these behavioral psychological criticisms and amendments. Okay, now when we ask what are we talking about and how many are there, how many homunculus economici are there, or how many models of Homo economicus are there worth the name, this seems to create some problems, and that the Stanford Symposium was an indication of that, because people talking about Homo economicus evolving, so we start with some version of it. Okay, it evolves. Is it still Homo economicus? Do we use the same name for it, the evolved version? How do we call the previous version? Then we need further attributes or indexes or something like that to distinguish between all these versions. But of course, one possible way to go is to fix it, the meaning, a definite version described in terms of a fixed list of assumptions, say Savage version or some such thing. Or a family of closely related versions, and then of course it all depends on how closely is closely. And this is the most permissive and flexible idea, and this would have interesting consequences for at least our verbal behavior. Any conception of human behavior that is used for investigating economic phenomena. So whenever we have it's regardless of the discipline, economic sociology, economic anthropology, cultural, political economy, or whatever we have, or standard neoclassical economics, behavioral economics, whenever they have a notion of an agent, economic agent, that's Homo economicus. And this would make sense, wouldn't it? It's the Homo in the economic arena. That's it, Homo economicus. But of course, this would not have the capacities of distinguishing between different versions. So each such version would then need to have a separate name to be separated from one another. Or finally, any conception of human behavior that is found in the most up-to-date economic theory. Who is to tell? Well, anyway, A and B seem to be closer to common usages of Homo economicus. This is how they usually are conceived. B, C, and D are comfortable with the idea that it evolves, or at least can evolve. B and C allow for multiple versions, whereas A and D allow just one, or at least one at a time. But anyway, this has interesting consequences for the way we talk. And I don't see any kind of consensus. I mean, this has not even been discussed, I think, in the debates over Homo economicus. The vocabulary we use when naming different versions. Okay, now this is where I'm on fragile grounds. I'm not a biologist, and I see philosophers of biology in the audience. So here we go. I just jump. This is the title of a Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist, Richard Taylor, From Homo Economicus to Homo Sapiens. It's a very, very highly cited, published in a very, very key publication, Journal of Economic Perspectives, and a very highly cited piece of writing. I have not seen, maybe I've missed something, but I haven't seen anybody dispute the title of the paper. But in the paper, he says, I'm predicting that Homo economicus will evolve into Homo sapiens. Now, this allows for at least two possibilities. Homo economicus will die, is left behind, will go extinct, and then replaced by an improved conception of economic agency. Or does Homo economicus survive, but yet evolves by improvements? That's also a possibility. And actually, it's not clear it is either of these when looking more closely, and in a moment you will see why. So this is what he then says. we need a richer characterization of economic agents, and those are the characteristics of Homo sapiens: boundedly rational, slower in learning, diverse, reduced information processing capabilities, more emotional, and so forth. These are supposed to be characteristics of Homo sapiens that Homo economicus lacks. Okay, now thinking of the very concept of Homo sapiens in disciplines such as biology, anthropology, archaeology, this is of course the image we often see. And then looking at those characteristics, I mean, they are mainly anatomical. Characteristics. Also, the image there, it's depicts anatomical evolution, as it were. And then we might ask, how useful are these characteristics for the investigation of contemporary economy? So in what way it would be nice for Homo economicus to evolve into Homo sapiens, as Thaler recommends and predicts, actually. Okay. Now, there might be an excuse for Thaler's idea that Homo economicus will evolve into Homo sapiens. Just looking at what these phrases, these component phrases mean. Sapiens means wise, discerning, sensible, sage, knowing, etc. So there are cognitive. Actually, there's nothing anatomical here. These are cognitive characteristics. So maybe this makes Thaler's idea okay. Maybe it saves the Homo economicus will evolve into Homo sapiens from the charge of focusing on anatomy only. And sapiens could then be taken to have a richer range of cognitive characteristics than Homo economicus. But as such, it is also compatible with the cognitive hypercapacity of Homo economicus too. So the one that was predicted to evolve into Homo sapiens. Okay. And then another possible excuse for Thaler, I mean, if he felt like that, like defending his title and his prediction, there is this book, recent book, Survival of the Friendliest. And this is the idea that actually Homo sapiens is friendlier than Homo neanderthalensis, and therefore it survived. So it's thanks to our social propensities, we are more empathetic, more caring, more collaborative, friendlier, etc. That's why we survived, and neanderthalensis did not. Okay, so the conclusion, one of the conclusions might be that Homo economicus is more accurate as a model of neanderthalensis than of sapiens. Interesting. Saying Homo economicus will evolve into Homo sapiens seems odd because it already did. Thaler is predicting that Homo economicus will evolve into Homo sapiens, but it already did thousands of years ago, from neanderthalensis to Homo sapiens. Okay. I'm just having fun with him. But here is something more interesting and relevant, perhaps. Concepts are often contrastive. So the semantics of Homo sapiens is contrastive in a special sense. Its definition seeks to distinguish one species from other animal species among primates, especially from our relatives within the genus Homo. So we have Homo erectus, heidelbergensis, etc., and then we have Homo sapiens, and sapiens belongs to this genus, and we distinguish Homo sapiens is the concept that we use for distinguishing one species from others within this genus. So it doesn't seem to be belong to the same kind of family of concepts as Homo economicus. So the more natural contrastives of Homo economicus are among human social agents within the species, Homo sapiens. So we already have Homo sapiens in place. Then we have different versions or different partial images of the characteristics of Homo sapiens, like Homo sociologicus, politicus, reciprocans, and so forth. This is the sort of the natural contrast for Homo economicus. So Homo economicus already is a version of Homo sapiens. So would it be ought to say it evolves into Homo sapiens, or it actually would evolve into it only by adopting all of its characteristics, by becoming the whole of it. Okay, I skip this. But then further interesting speculations. I really let my imaginations fly unhinged. So we know that one and the same model with Homo economicus as among its premises can be applied to not only human beings and their behavior, but also artificial intelligence and to bacteria. Okay, now this suggests that we should drop Homo, just economicus and then so forth, because the humanity of it is not required at all for the construct to be applicable. So what all these share, I mean, the reason for its applicability to all these cases with different degrees of cognitive capacity, from 0 to close to infinity, is that there is a stress on environment, situation, context. So the interior of these agents doesn't matter at all, or doesn't matter much. The exterior and the pressures imposed from the exterior, they matter everything. So if there is resource scarcity in the exterior, then these entities, human beings, artificial intelligence, bacteria will behave in a way that can be predicted by the Homo economicus model. So this means then that there is no necessary focus on selected cognitive properties of Homo sapiens. There's no room for desires, beliefs, pleasure, pain, happiness, and those kinds of things that also behavioral economics keeps talking about. So maybe we need to drop sapiens too. So, and by implication, Homo economicus goes down the drain too. This I find somewhat interesting. Okay, something about the explanation. Taylor, the same guy, suggests that it seems logical that basing descriptive economic models on more realistic conceptions of economic agents is bound to increase the explanatory power of the models. It may appear logical, but it surely is not, at least without major qualification. We need to ask what is it to explain. I will not go into that, but this is the more relevant question for us. I will have a few slides on this. What explains what? And I think there's a lot of confusion here, both in standard economics literature and behavioral economics literature. And psychologists seem to be completely confused about what kind of explanatory business they are involved in. So what exactly are the explanantia and the explananda? They, of course, need to be aligned with one another. And this I see a major problem here. This is very simplified, but anyway, might help illuminate the kind of problems we are dealing with. So we have these are possible explananda, things to be explained along two dimensions: token type and then individual, organization, and aggregate. Now, aggregate is not a very good phrase for what that could indicate, such as social patterns and so forth. But anyway, so if you think of much of the writing activity, experimentation, what have you within behavioral economics, psychology inspired or informed economic experimentation, for instance, it seems to be about some particular individual's choice here and now, there and then. So it's a token event that involves individuals rather than organizations, rather than anything aggregate. This is simplifying, but anyway, helps see the issues. Whereas, if you look at what economists do, standard traditional economics, it's about explaining aggregate type behavior, such as the downward sloping market demand curve or upward sloping supply curve. And then what you then assume about individual players in the market might be something very different from what you need to assume when explaining Mrs. Jones's actual choices. Now, thinking of the exponentia, the explaining side of things, in standard economics, those exponentia are organizations. They're families and business firms. They are not individuals. Of course, we may have one-person firms and single-person families, etc. But much of the time, they are organizations. Some of them are big organizations, especially on the business side, etc. And these are the explainers. They're not individuals. And that's, I mean, what does behavioral economics have to say about the exponentia, the exponent side, if it focuses on individual token behavior only? And then, of course, this is the standard situation in economics, explaining macro patterns in terms of these organizational units of households and business firms, their properties. And this may be another way of showing how these distinctions are necessary to make to understand what is going on and what should be going on in these explanatory activities by behavioral economists and standard economists. I mean, distinguish between decision theory and price theory or theory of the markets. They have very different explananda and other functions, etc. So decision theory explains or advises or whatever, individual and maybe organization behavior, while price theory explains, or theory of the market explains, aggregate behavior and larger social patterns. And it's quite obvious that different assumptions about human agency are appropriate in each case. So very different needs and conditions regarding images of economic agency. And indeed, it seems that much of psychological and behavioral testing is in context A rather than context B. So, and the relevance for that, for context B, price theory and theory of the markets is not that obvious. Okay. I'll skip that. More on applicability conditions. We already actually talked about applicability, but nevertheless, there are competing rival conceptions of the applicability conditions of Homo economicus. One of them, of course, is this arrogant conviction that I mean, here represented by expected utility theory, it applies universally, perhaps subject to learning to be rational. Repeat the task sufficiently several times, and then the agent will learn to be rational. In the sense that is suggested by expected utility theory. This you find this belief, this universalist belief, still in, especially amongst economists. But then you can relativize it regarding the type of agent, and Sachs and Fairchon. I mean, neither of them is a pure economist. Sachs is a philosopher, Fairchon a political scientist. They suggest that the appropriate domain of applicability of Homo economicus lies in business behavior rather than consumer behavior. And this gets us back to what I said earlier about bacteria and etc. being in similar situations when there is external pressure strong enough. And here we talk about competitive pressures. If the competitive pressures are strong enough, then that kind of forces the agent to behave roughly in the way that is assumed about them in the Homo economicus model. Whereas consumers are kind of freer. They can be more relaxed. I mean, they don't easily die or be excluded from the race or something like that if they take it easier. Okay, and then type of decision. Also, you can relativize the applicability conditions in this way. And this is something that is a discovery by some behavioral studies. Simple and recurrent decisions. That's where Homo economicus seems to apply better than complex long-term decisions. Of course, complex long-term decisions are such things such as buying a house for the next few decades, or finding somebody to marry. That requires a marriage market, of course, etc. And then we make huge mistakes there, whereas very simple, repeated decisions, they are easier. We learn to be rational regarding those. That's the idea. Whether that's correct is another matter. Anyway, but this is something I want to emphasize: the type of institutional arena. Maybe the applicability of Homo economicus also should be made relative to the type of institutional arena wherein the various agents act. And here, market, that's the key notion. So this is, of course, not a new idea at all, but it has a long history also in social sciences, not just in economics, but elsewhere in social science. So the market as the natural habitat of Homo economicus. And if you think of the primitive concepts in terms of which the concept of the market could be characterized, those include exchange and competition. And the non-tuism is the idea that those transactors in the market, exchanging things, that may be money for service or money for a good or whatever. In these situations, exchange situations, neither party plays to the pocket of the other. This is a very simple idea. I play to my own pocket, and the other party, I understand that the other party also plays to her own pocket. We are selfish or self-seeking in that simple way. But once we are settled, once we are done with the exchange, we can do whatever. We can use the commodity or the money we got from the exchange in whatever way we want. We may go and drink ourselves to death, or we may donate it to the poor, or we may cater our family, whatever. We may be utterly unselfish right after we have exited this market situation. But when we are in the market and we are conducting an act of exchange, that's where we require to be selfish. Calculate, play strategically, whatever it requires to play the maximum benefit to my own pocket. Nothing else is needed. There is no talk about human nature here. We don't need, economics does not require a notion of human nature. This is not about human nature. This is about what happens in this arena when this act of exchange takes place. Competition is, of course, another primitive concept of the market. And here, it's a fairly simple idea that participants in a competition prefer surviving or winning rather than becoming losers or dropping out entirely. This creates pressures upon us. Of course, there might be some of us who prefer being losers or something like that, or they are afraid of being winners or something like that, but still many of us want to win or at least survive rather than lose or dropping out entirely. Okay, once we are put in a competitive situation, then we behave more like Homo Economicus. And once we are out in different kinds of non-competitive situations, we behave differently. I mean, in another lecture, I could start talking about how Homo Academicus has turned into Homo Economicus in current institutional arrangements when we are forced to compete with one another and things like that. What consequences that has for us, our mentality, and the science and its output on the other hand. But that will be another occasion. But anyway, you see, this is a pretty nicely, broadly applicable ideas. So no claims about human nature required. There's a, I mean, just talking about the business side of things, the Fritz Machlup, who was a very smart guy, he was an economist, but he was philosophically very literate and insightful, wrote a number of very interesting philosophical papers about economics. So it's kind of philosophy of science type, self-reflective type. Now, this is the presidential address he gave at the American Economic Association, published in 1967. I mean, he recognized, I mean, it's like everybody at that time, that there is a multiplicity of theories of the firm, different kinds of theories. Some of them taught at the university economics department, some others at business schools, etc., managerial, organizational, etc. And then we had the neoclassical theory of the firm, or the marginalist theory, etc., heavily criticized by these others because the marginalist theory portrays business firms in a way that doesn't resemble real business firms at all. They are devoid of internal organization, for example, entirely. They strictly calculate the marginal costs and marginal revenue and equate the two in their hiring decisions, for example, and things like that. And then he defends the neoclassical theory, suggesting, pointing out what the proper explanatory question is when having that theory as part of the answer. The question is, what qualitative changes in market level variables, price and quantity, in response to changes in conditions will occur? It's not about the behavior of individual firms at all. While these other theories of the firm, organizational, managerial, what have you, might answer questions about the behavior of individual firms. I mean, you see here similarities with what I said earlier about behavioral economics and its concept, explananda. Okay, and then the conditions of applicability of this marginalist theory, for example, are that there must be a very large number of firms, actually up to infinity, but that's for mathematical purposes. Competitive conditions, so indeed, I mean, no collusions, no immediate interactions, everything goes via the market price, etc. And then the explanatory questions as those two above. And if these conditions are met, then the idealizations, falsity, and omissions are negligible in the model of competitive business firm. Profit maximizing, capable of calculation to the last cent of a dollar, a perfect foresight, etc. Lack of internal organization. Okay, now the talk about human nature. This is what you find in text of on behavioral economics. They say that they have a better grasp of what human nature is than do traditional economists. So they seem to be hunting for this human nature rather than specifying the behavioral propensities that are fortified and triggered by specific institutional context. And then, I mean, we need to raise these questions. How do these ultimatum games, dictator games, etc., that they are so fond of and active in using, translate into large markets conceived in terms of exchange and competition? Often these game experiments deal with situations that seem to be very far away from real-world market conditions. So there seems to be a gap between the evidence collected with these game experiments on the one hand, and the proper domain of application. Okay, now I'll move on saying a few things about the roles of idealization. Idealizations are false assumptions. I mean, they're recognizably false. Their falsehood is not hidden. Their falsehood is kind of deliberately exploited and used for epistemic purposes such as explanation, unification, and things of that kind. I can see at least four. There are more than four, but let it suffice here. 4 roles of idealized models. Actually wrote a paper on that a couple of years ago. The minimal model. So use a model such as, have Homo Economicus as a model, I mean, one specific version of it. Use it as is, and then find some appropriate functions for it. So you show what it can do for you, what epistemic services it can provide, just as is, without any modification, and so forth. And this is indeed, for instance, MacLoop's idea of a perfectly competitive firm having certain functions. It's a minimal model, and it has been defended, can be defended in those terms. Then we have this very, very popular idea of an early step model. So use a very simplified idealized model as a point of departure. It's not the final word on anything. It's just a starting point. Then you go into later steps and you de-isolate what you isolated in the early step model by de-idealization, by relaxing those idealizations maybe one by one, or maybe in a bunch, whatever, adding richer content to the model. Now, the direction of this process then, of course, should depend on the explanatory questions asked and facts found, because you have a point of departure, simple model, a minimal model, then you start relaxing its assumptions. Do you go that way or do you go this way? Depends on what you want and what you find. So it's this is also would be an interesting frame of thought for thinking of what has happened in behavioral economics, because there is a flavor of early step modeling, using Homo economicus as an early step and then start relaxing its idealizing assumptions. But this seems to be the dominant way of doing behavioral economics, using the simple, highly idealized model as a benchmark, as what I call an explanatory ideal type. This is nothing very original, because here I'm using, at least that's what I believe, and there's some evidence actually in that paper, was Max Weber's authentic notion of ideal type. The simple model as a benchmark. And for it to be a benchmark, then means that we should be interested in deviations from that benchmark. And we identify those deviations, we measure them as it were, we describe them, and then we construe them as explananda, the phenomena to be explained. And then the question is, in what terms do we explain those deviations? We don't use the same simple model that we use for as an explanatory ideal type, as a benchmark for explaining those deviations. We need other explanatory resources, and this is where all the psychology comes in. We use these psychological insights for explaining these deviations. And then there is a final way of using idealized models as normative models, and I have a bit of things to say about that. But thinking of Homo economicus now, all of these strategies, all of these ways of using idealized models, such as Homo economicus itself, keep Homo economicus alive. That's interesting, isn't it? Okay, so there's nothing here going on in behavioral economics or elsewhere that would suggest rejecting, refuting, leaving Homo economicus behind entirely and replacing it with something else. Okay, and here is what I think seems to be the dominant way of doing behavioral economics, using Homo economicus as an explanatory ideal type. So deviations from this ideal are of special interest, and those deviations are then what behavioral economists call the systematic anomalies, biases, and they are supposedly robust, so they keep being what they are regardless of a specific context. They are identified by experimental means. Okay, and then those deviations, these anomalies and biases, are construed as explananda, and then resources from psychology and whatever you have, and whatever serves the purpose, are brought in to help explain these deviations. But the core component of Homo economicus remains, and this is the core component, constraint optimization itself as the decision mechanism. It's not endangered. That's intact, remains intact. So what happens here is kind of piecemeal de-idealization without more radical re-isolation of the core mechanism. The core mechanism stays intact. So there is, if you wish, increased realisticness, in that a larger range of motivations, for instance, pro-social preferences, whatever you want to include, and cognitive imperfections can be included in the model. That makes it more realistic in a sense. But then there is an increased unrealisticness associated with this process of increasing the realisticness by spreading the a range of preferences, etc. And the increased unrealisticness is because of the constraint optimization task becomes ever more difficult. It's close to impossible because the task is so much more difficult. Once you have a range of these variables increased, then the cognitive task of providing the optimum solution becomes far more difficult. And that actually makes this phrase that is so common to these behavioral economists rather amusing even. They say they are providing more realistic psychological foundations. Now I would say that it's the constraint optimization mechanism is the foundation, and that is then left intact. So at least not regarding those foundations, anything realistic is being provided. So the benefit here is that the greater range of details, all those deviations and biases and anomalies, etc., they become explained, but each of them becomes explained with a separate model. There's no single unifying model that would explain them all. So the cost here is that there's a loss in the unifying power of models. When you use Homo Economicus for explaining everything, then you unify everything in terms of that model. But here you have all these deviations from the model, and you explain each such deviation in terms of a different model that have little in common. So you don't have a unified picture anymore. So that's the cost, if you wish. It's a cost provided you accept the convention of unification being an epistemic value. Okay, then there is this question of idealization in social sciences. It's similar to idealization in natural sciences. I mean, we have in natural sciences, idealization does a good job in assuming vacuum, frictionless plane, planets as mass points, rigid body, etc., etc. I mean, natural scientific theories are full of these false idealizations, and yet they seem to be doing a pretty good epistemic job. Is it similar in the social sciences? I mean, a major difference here is that physical objects do not and they cannot respond to idealizing assumptions made of them, whereas human beings can and sometimes do. And this indeed also is the case with Homo economicus. When we are assumed to be Homo economicus and we become aware of it, either by way of sort of hearing somebody saying that we are Homo economicus, but also by indirect ways of being subject to policies that assume that we are. And this takes us back to what I said in the beginning about unions' behavior today in response to government's behavior earlier, and also probably in the future. So forces that push us towards Homo economicus. This makes it now. This now opens up new horizons regarding society, mentality, civilization, future of civilization, and all those interesting issues. Now, you have heard of nudging as part of behavioral economics or deriving from behavioral economics. It's based on using Homo economicus as a normative ideal type. So now distinguishing between these two kinds of ideal type, the explanatory that I discussed a few moments ago, explaining deviations from the ideal type, where ideal means extreme. Some variables take an extreme value. Whereas in a normative ideal type, we seek to approximate that ideal closely. Here, And we seek to do that because ideal here means desirable, advisable, recommendable, or something like that, something good, something that we should go for. And indeed, it seems that in behavioral policies, nudging policies, this is the underlying idea. So these deviations from the ideal of Homo economicus, or biases, anomalies, they are deficiencies. They are deficiencies in us. Something's lacking in us that are to be removed or minimized, and thereby helping us to perform better in pursuing our interests. And here, I come back to that what I said earlier about psychology. Psychology has as part of its ethos to identify and remedy dysfunctions in individual behavior. So that economics is borrowing from psychology, the kind of psychology that shares this ethos, that the individuals are deficient in many ways, dysfunctional in many ways, and then it's task of psychology to provide the remedy. So nudging or boosting, for that matter, seeks to help us more rationally satisfy our preferences. Hence, they push us towards more closely approximating the behavior, at least in some respect, of Homo economicus. So it's about removing obstacles, but only on the consumer side. Only on the consumers. The consumers are the fragile part here. They're the ones who make all these terrible mistakes and are biased and so forth. So removing these obstacles on the consumer side to the smooth functioning of unregulated markets. The smooth functioning of unregulated markets require us to be as Homo economicus-like as possible. If are not, then it will damage the functioning of the markets. So better to manipulate us to become fit for the functioning of the market than the other way around. Now, there are many other things in society that sort of keep pushing us towards closer approximations of Homo economicus. Money is one. I mean, economic psychologists have made all these interesting experiments and tests suggesting that when exposed to money in one way or another, handling money, primed with money, even talk of money, people change in their behavior. And this results in reduced helping behavior, reduced compassion, business decision frame and unethical outcomes, endorsement of free market and social inequality, etc. So mere presence of money or having been primed with money makes us more Homo economicus-like. Economics education, there's been a lot of literature on this, and this is of course somewhat embarrassing for economics education, educators and economic students, etc. Economic students are found to behave more in accordance with Homo economicus, more selfish, more strategic. They give less to charity, exhibit less honesty, view greed more favorably, those kinds of things. And then this has been one of the debates here, whether it's a matter of self-selection, whether they already were that way when choosing economics as their subject of study, or whether it's an outcome of indoctrination, the teaching they received as economics students. But and this is actually the conclusion of this very paper. Even a brief exposure. You don't need to be an economic student. You just take a class or two of basic economics, and then it will make you more Homo economicus-like in your behavior. Okay. Now there are various kinds of attempted explanations for why this would happen, etc. Actually, the previous slide showed the article in which the author suggests that it's an instructor-demand effect. This somehow students want to please the educators. But it also might be that this comes from the study of models in philosophy of science, where one of the basic ideas is that when you study the world by studying models about the world, then you objectify or reify those models and take them as your direct target of examination. Then you sort of throw yourself, especially when you have an economic model where there are assumptions about individual behavior, then you throw yourself in that fantasy world of those models, and then you start learning the behavioral propensities from that fantasy world rather than behave the way you would otherwise behave in the real world, in the wild, as it were. So this is what I have offered as an also rather obvious explanation for what happens. But then there's an interesting further distinction to be made here, namely, most of this literature has been about the impact of economics education on the behavioral propensities of economic students themselves. How economic students, are they becoming more selfish, more greedy, more asocial, more immoral, and those kinds of things as an outcome of having been educated in economics, models within which Homo economicus is being assumed. That's surely will be an ongoing debate. But then this is at least equally important, the impact on the expectations by economic students about others' behavior. And I think the evidence is more straightforward about this matter. There is hardly any counter evidence on this. They develop ideas, their own expectations and beliefs about other people's behavior that are in line with Homo economicus. And of course, this is what matters for these economic students. When they grow up, go to the world, become economists in the ministries and policymakers and advisors, whatever. They have internalized the idea that everybody else, I might be okay, but everybody else is a Homo economicus. And therefore, everybody else should be treated as Homo economicus. So the advice they give, the policy recommendations they give, the institutions they design, etc., they all assume that people are Homo economicus. And then there is this body of literature that shows what follows from that. Samuel Bowles was at the Stanford Symposium, one of the speakers. A wonderful, wonderful book, The Moral Economy, Why Good Incentives Are No Substitute for Good Citizens. This is about incentive-based policy. When governments exercise, or whoever exercise incentive-based policies, they assume that the subjects are close to Homo economicus, like in their behavior. So people respond to incentives. There are people who think that this actually defines economics. This is the key principle of economics that defines the whole discipline. People respond to incentives. This is what we believe, and this defines our disciplinary identity. So if this is so, then let's treat people as such. And then what happens when we make this distinction? Internal motivation, external motivation. Being incentivized is to be triggered for your external motivations. And when you're internally motivated, then your behavior derives from your sense of duty, your sense of whatever, love or avoidance of shame or regret or expected regret or those kinds of things. And then economists typically assume either that internal motives, this classical traditional morally flavored motivations are absent or negligible entirely, or that the two motives, even if there are internal motives as well, these two sets of motive are additively separable. So however much you incentivize people in terms of monetary incentives, doesn't have any consequences for these internal motivations, these traditional moral matters that drive people. And this is now rejecting this additivity principle then gives rise to this idea of crowding out. So if there is an overuse of material incentives or by way of manipulation of external motives, this fortifies an amoral self-interest in people, and this gives rise to an erosion of moral and social motivation. Okay, now keep in mind what I said in the beginning about the strike on today. The unions politically striking against the government that wants to incentivize everything here, doesn't pay any attention to this being a high trust society, that this high level of trust in this society may play a major role in the way things go, how things are coordinated in this society. They think that everything has to be monetarily incentivized in order for the economy and the rest of society would go just fine. Okay, I'll skip that. But this is then, I mean, regarding. I see that time is running. The second point regarding society, what impact would exercising these incentive-based policies to extremes? What kind of citizens do we want to produce or want to be? What kind of society do we want to live on? Only as self-regarding strategic calculators, always just responding to external incentives and forgetting about our internal moral motivations? Or would we rather like to be people with complex motivations, multiple purposes, including self and other regarding intentions, sense of responsibility, autonomy, self-determination, being respected, a respected member of community, those kinds of things? Would we like to have a high trust and smoothly functioning society, as I thought this country was? Or do we want to have a low trust society with high transaction costs, as this country is becoming, thanks to the current government? Okay, so this is again the reference to the situation today that, as you see, arouses my emotions. So, but anyway, this is another force in society that keeps pushing us towards a Homo Economicus mode of behavior, the marketization of society. This is a slowly proceeding mega trend in current global world. So this has to do with the arena of action. And the question is, what's appropriate, what is morally acceptable and practically functional behavior in the arena of the market? And then the idea that this is the natural habitat of Homo economicus, and that in the market, closer approximations of Homo economicus will do better. And when society keeps marketizing, ever new spheres of society become marketized or market-like, either spontaneously or by design. And ever new spheres of life, social life, are conceived as markets. So we internalize this idea that we are now in a market that prepares us for market-apt behavior, of course. And what's market-apt behavior? Homo economicus-like behavior. So marketization of society may be pushing us towards Homo economization. We are becoming ever more like that. So institutions and individuals co-evolved in this way. I was supposed to. I didn't have time to prepare this slide, but there is a interesting piece coming from phenomenology. The phenomenology of Homo economicus. This is a combination of Max Weber and Edmund Husserl in the work of Alfred Schütz. The idea of when we typify, social life requires that we keep typifying various kinds of things, including people, and we use the type Homo economicus when being confronted with others in the market. So this is actually very much part of our common sense framework, even though, of course, it's full of tensions, because when we are dealing with people outside of the market, we typify them in entirely different ways. But no more about that. An empirical study from a bunch of Japanese psychologists, a study of Tokyo residents, checking whether they are approximations of Homo economicus or not. And they divided Homo economicus in two classes, kind of the genuine Homo economicus and the quasi Homo economicus, and then the rest. So what they discovered was that genuine Homo economicus, 7% of the population of Tokyo are actually genuine homunculus economici, and 8.7% are quasi homunculus economici. The genuine ones are selfish and rational. They know how to satisfy their preferences, their personal preferences, and they succeed in it. Whereas the quasi ones are impulsive, and therefore they, even though they are extremely selfish, they ruin their cause. So the first class, intelligent, consistent, planful, socially successful, high life satisfaction. The second class, impulsive, socially unsuccessful, low life satisfaction, etc. But the vast majority are ordinary people with pro-social preferences, community spirits, and so forth. So the obvious advice from behavioral economics would be that let's nudge the bee. Let's get them back on track. Anyway, so when designing policies and institutions by assuming Homo economicus, you will be catering for those 7% or whatever the proportion would be, who are closest to the image. And their inclinations will be reinforced. Their inclinations to behave like proper Homo economicus will be reinforced because that brings them success. Those whose skills and motivations are further away from Homo economicus will not do so well. Their interest will not be served by these institutions that were designed with Homo economicus in mind. Yet they too will feel a pressure to become Homo economicus, with consequences for mental health and political preferences. And this is what we are witnessing now. And then some people just shout that we need more mental health services. And others that fascism is rising again. Let's do something about it. But none of these people understand the sources of these phenomena. Okay, what's natural for Homo sapiens? We come back to the sapiens theme. There's an alternative line here. Those biases that are identified as such by behavioral economics are part of our physical and mental constitution, designed for and adapted to the circumstances that were in place in the course of our long evolutionary history. Nothing deficient about them. They should not be cured. So they're not irrational propensities, but evolutionarily rational. Okay. So what's natural for Homo sapiens? Natural, these biases plus community orientation. What's unnatural for Homo sapiens is what's required of us by market-mediated success, by much of Homo Economicus-based economic policies and by much institutional design based on these same assumptions. And the result is tensions inside that may give rise to anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems. Are we marching towards a new species, perhaps? Is there a fellow economicus in the making? There is market selection, for sure. Society is increasingly marketized. So you do, the more you approximate, the better you approximate Homo economicus, the better you do. And then we have all the technologies that are increasingly available, human enhancement, genetic engineering of those who can afford it. And there are all sorts of artificial intelligence, human partnerships coming, chips in the brain, etc. So maybe there's a new species coming, fit for the market, and Homo sapiens will be extinct or enslaved. And then we get, I mean, the Nobel Prize winning Richard Taylor said that he predicts that Homo economicus will evolve into Homo sapiens, but maybe it's the other way around. Homo sapiens will evolve into Homo economicus. I hope this was slightly enlightening, but at least a great deal of confusing. That guarantees that it was appetizing for whatever will come later. Thank you.